She's carrying drugs? The flight attendant's voice pierced through the quiet hum of first class like a siren. Every head turned, every phone rose, and every eye without exception locked on the only black woman in the cabin. She sat in seat 2A, motionless, too composed. The flight attendant, tall, blonde, trembling just enough to appear heroic, held up a small vacuum-sealed package like it was Exhibit A in a courtroom. This was found in her handbag, she announced. It's prescription-grade narcotics, illegal. Gasps, whispers, cameras. The cabin became a stage, and she, whether guilty or not, was already sentenced in the court of public opinion. Someone muttered, "Figures." Another, "They'll let anyone in first class these days." And the video was already streaming live. Two air marshals approached. She didn't resist. She simply stood up, slow, elegant, dignified, and turned toward the accusing voice behind her. She looked the flight attendant dead in the eye, her voice calm as steel. "You just made the worst mistake of your life." No one knew what she meant. Not the passengers recording. Not the air marshals guiding her down the aisle. Not the woman who just publicly humiliated her. But they were all about to find out. Because the woman in 2A wasn't just any passenger. She was a CIA agent, and she was on duty. 3 hours earlier, in a high-rise hotel room overlooking the glistening skyline of Chicago, Amara Davis stood in front of the mirror, buttoning the last clasp on her navy blazer. Her reflection was sharp, professional, unbothered. Her carry-on was packed with clinical precision. Laptop, reading glasses, tablet, and a slim leather folio filled with notes that meant nothing to anyone who didn't work at Langley. To most, she looked like a management consultant en route to a West Coast board meeting. But Amara Davis wasn't going to a meeting. She was going into the field. At 39, Amara had built a reputation inside the CIA that was equal parts admiration and awe. She didn't shout. She didn't rush. She simply got things done, quietly, efficiently, and without leaving fingerprints behind. Colleagues called her the whisper in the room. She had this uncanny ability to read a situation before it unfolded. Not magic, just the result of years of training, intuition, and watching people far more than she ever spoke to them. Today's assignment wasn't glamorous. It wasn't global. It was domestic. A routine cross-country flight tucked away inside the mundane operations of a commercial airline. "You're flying under your real name," her handler had said the night before. "You're just another passenger. First class, window seat. No one knows you're coming. Not the crew, not security. No one except the airline CEO. He's cooperating quietly. That's all we can afford." Amara had nodded. That was how she preferred it. Her objective? To quietly observe flight crew members suspected of being part of an organized drug trafficking network, using their security clearance and flight schedules to move high-grade prescription drugs across state lines. Packages small enough to tuck inside a makeup bag. Profits large enough to change lives or ruin them. It had started with a tip from an informant. Then inconsistencies in background checks. Then a passenger who had been falsely accused of carrying narcotics, who later turned out to be completely clean. That had been enough for Langley to send in someone like Amara. She moved through the airport like a shadow. No high heels, no dramatic sunglasses, just comfortable flats and a calm gait. She paused only to scan her boarding pass, giving the gate agent a polite smile. First class. Seat 2A. Her boarding was uneventful, just the way she liked it. But Amara never stopped working. As she walked down the jet bridge, she noted 2 ground crew members chatting quietly by a service hatch. Too quietly. She saw a gate agent typing something into a system that didn't match her screen's interface. She logged it all in her phone, an app disguised as a travel planner, but in truth, a secure encrypted note-taker that fed directly into the CIA's airborne intelligence database. On the plane, she moved like water, smooth, fluid, unreadable. As she placed her bag in the overhead compartment, she glanced toward the galley. That's when she saw her, the blonde flight attendant. Perfect hair, stiff smile, cool eyes. There was something about the way the woman's demeanor shifted when she noticed Amara. Not overt hostility, something subtler. Judgment, dismissal. A mental note that said, "You don't belong here." Amara had seen that look before. In private schools where she'd been the only black girl in the debate team. In boardrooms where her title was questioned until her badge was shown. In foreign cities where officials looked for a man when Agent Davis was called. But today, she wasn't showing any badge. Today, she was blending in. As she settled into her seat, she exhaled slowly, almost meditatively. She reached for her tablet and opened a mock presentation about leadership development. To the untrained eye, she looked like any overworked executive reviewing slides before landing. But behind the screen, her camera app was recording in standby. Every gesture, every whisper, every move the crew made would be documented. Her eyes swept the cabin slowly. She took in the other passengers. Most were white. All were dressed well. Some already looking at her like she was the anomaly in the room. That didn't bother her. She wasn't there for comfort. She was there for clarity. And if this flight was hiding what she suspected it was, she'd find it. Quietly, efficiently, without leaving fingerprints. But for all her preparation, Amara had not expected this flight to turn on her. She hadn't expected to be the one accused. Kendra Miles was the kind of flight attendant passengers remembered. Not for her warmth, no, but for her look, her polish, her control. Blonde hair in a perfect twist, not a strand out of place. A crisp uniform, pressed so sharp it seemed to bite the air. And a smile that hovered on the edge of sincerity, but never quite landed. She was 33 with 11 years in the airline industry. By all accounts, she was the picture of professionalism. On paper, her record was spotless. Customer reviews were solid, if not glowing. And she knew just how to charm the right people, especially the ones who could sign off on promotions. But beneath the surface, Kendra was burning. She was burning with resentment, with disappointment, with debt. She lived in a high-rise she couldn't afford. Drove a leased car that looked flashier than her paycheck would allow. Her nails were always perfect, but her credit score was in ruins. And every month, the bills came faster than the hours she could pick up. Worse still, the promotion she'd been chasing for years, senior cabin crew, had recently gone to someone younger. Someone newer, someone black. A colleague named Alyssa. Bright, kind, always smiling. The type passengers actually remembered because she made them feel seen. Kendra never said it out loud, at least not in the words she was thinking. But she felt it. It's all about quotas now, she'd mutter over cocktails with other crew. They're promoting people just to tick a diversity box. It's not merit anymore, not experience. No one ever challenged her, not directly. Some shifted in their seats, others just changed the subject. But the words hung in the air like smoke from a fire no one dared put out. 8 months ago, drowning in financial pressure and bitter silence, Kendra made a choice. A first-class passenger, wealthy and polished, had approached her quietly after a flight. He made an offer, simple, low risk. Use her access to carry small packages in her bag. Leave them in specific locations on board. Someone else would pick them up. No customs, no questions. The money was good, too good. And once she said yes, the next trip was easier. Then the next. And soon, she stopped thinking about the risk. It became routine. Until last week, when a fellow crew member was quietly suspended after TSA flagged something odd. It hadn't made the news, but word got around. Someone got sloppy. And suddenly, Kendra's comfortable side gig didn't feel so safe anymore. This time, she told her contact she needed insurance. "I'm not going down for this," she hissed over a burner phone in an airport bathroom. "If something happens, I need a way to shift the attention to someone else." The voice on the other end had paused. Then agreed. A second package was delivered, small, light, sealed tight. She tucked it into her makeup bag alongside her blush and travel toothbrush. That was her plan B. On the tarmac, Kendra moved with practiced ease. She greeted ground crew, flashed her badge, joked with the gate agent. But her smile didn't quite reach her eyes, because today she was more alert than usual. She scanned the manifest. First class was full, 8 passengers. Mostly business types, white-collar, set white-skinned, except for one name. Davis, Amara, window seat. No title listed, paid in full with personal card. Kendra paused. It wasn't just the name, it was the memory it triggered. Black, woman, first class. The same kind of passenger she'd side-eyed more than once. Not out loud, of course. But in her head, who paid for that ticket? Do they belong up here? Later, as passengers boarded, Kendra stood at the front, smile fixed in place. The executives, the retirees, the quiet couple in row 1. And then, Amara. She was striking, understated, confident without trying. She carried herself like someone who'd been through storms and learned to walk dry, and she didn't smile back. Not rude, Not aggressive, just aware, measured. Their eyes met, only for a moment, but it was long enough. Something in Kendra shifted, a flicker of defensiveness, discomfort, challenge. She turned to her fellow attendant, Tyler, and whispered just loud enough, "They'll let anyone into first class these days, huh?" Tyler said nothing, just handed her the tray of drinks and looked away. And in that instant, before the plane even left the ground, Kendra made a decision. She didn't know who Amara was, but she knew one thing with chilling certainty. That woman doesn't belong in first class. At 35,000 feet, time stretches in strange ways. Moments linger longer, silences feel louder. And small things, very small things, start to matter. Amara sat quietly in seat 2A, tablet open on her tray, stylus in hand. To anyone glancing over, she was immersed in a spreadsheet. In reality, she was logging behaviors. Not just anything. Patterns, subtle shifts in tone, in posture, in attention. The kind of things most passengers might write off as coincidence or bad service. But Amara wasn't most passengers. She was trained to notice what wasn't obvious. It started with something small, the drinks service. Kendra approached row 1 with a bright, chipper smile. "Good morning, Mr. Callahan. Would you like orange juice or sparkling water?" She said his name. She said, "Sir." She added a smile that lingered just a little longer than necessary. Next, the elderly white couple in 1B and 1C. Soft banter, a chuckle. "Let me know if you need anything at all." Then she reached Amara. No smile, no eye contact, just a clipped question, cold and mechanical. "Drink?" Not, "Would you like something to drink?" Not, "Ma'am?" Just one word. Flat, almost careless. Amara looked up. "Sparkling water, please," she said calmly. Kendra turned without acknowledgement. When she returned, she placed the glass with a soft thud, spilling a few drops onto Amara's tray. No napkin, no apology, just walked away. It wasn't aggressive, it wasn't loud, but it was deliberate. Amara had seen this before. The silent hierarchy of who deserves respect and who doesn't. She didn't react. She made a note, then closed the tablet halfway and started observing more deeply. Across the aisle in 2B, an older woman with soft gray curls and a floral scarf had been watching. Margaret Whitmore, 68, retired schoolteacher from Kansas City. The type who knitted during long flights and always carried hard candies in her purse. She'd been watching Kendra too, and she didn't like what she saw. She'd noticed the way the attendant lit up for white passengers, warm, friendly, chatty, and how she dimmed like a light switch around Amara. Margaret had grown up in a very different America. She'd seen prejudice, raw and unapologetic, but the kind that bothered her more now was this newer form. The quiet kind, the kind with a smile that only pointed one way. She didn't say anything. Not yet, but she started watching more carefully. 10 minutes passed. Amara pressed the call button above her seat. She wanted a blanket, nothing more. She waited. 1 minute, 3, 5. Kendra walked by twice, glancing her direction, but not stopping. A white man in 2C pressed his call button. Kendra was at his side in seconds. "What can I get you, sir?" "Scotch, neat. Absolutely." Smile. Walk away. Amara caught Kendra's eye on the third pass. "Excuse me," she said evenly. "I requested a blanket a few minutes ago. It's quite cold here." Kendra didn't bother with pleasantries. Her tone was flat. "Blankets are limited. I'll see if any are left." Then she disappeared. 20 more minutes passed. No blanket ever arrived. Amara wasn't surprised. She didn't need the blanket. She needed the data. Her eyes followed Kendra now, not just her movements, but her energy. She noticed how Kendra kept glancing toward her crew bag in the galley, how she adjusted it, checked it, then walked away, only to come back minutes later. Her shoulders were tense, hands slightly shaky when serving. Her smile cracked when no one was watching. Once, Amara caught a glimpse of Kendra whispering to Tyler, the other attendant. Their conversation stopped immediately when another passenger passed by. Another mental note. On her tablet, Amara opened her secure app and entered 3 lines of code. It activated a passive audio log, silent, undetectable. From this point forward, every sound within a 20-foot radius would be recorded and time-stamped. She glanced to the front. Kendra had disappeared into the galley again. Margaret leaned slightly across the aisle. "Excuse me, dear," she said to Amara softly. "I don't mean to intrude, but I saw how she treated you. That's not right." Amara offered a quiet smile. "Thank you for noticing." She appreciated it. Not for the sympathy. Amara didn't need sympathy, but it meant her observations were valid, confirmed, not just in her head, not just her instincts. This wasn't some isolated bad day from a tired crew member. No, this wasn't just bad service. It was the beginning of something much darker. The seatbelt sign was off. Cabin lights dimmed to a soft golden hue. Passengers had settled into a lull, some reading, others watching movies, a few gently nodding off in their seats. Amara stood slowly, slipping her tablet into the side pocket of her carry-on. She needed to stretch, and more importantly, she needed to observe from a different angle. "Excuse me," she said softly as she stepped past Margaret, who nodded kindly. She made her way toward the lavatory at the front of the cabin. Calm, composed, every step measured. Behind her, Kendra moved. She waited exactly 7 seconds, just long enough for Amara to close the bathroom door. Then she stepped toward seat 2A. To anyone watching, she looked helpful, professional, dutiful. A flight attendant adjusting a pillow, smoothing a blanket, checking on the comfort of her passenger. But her hands moved too fast. She leaned over the seat, lifted the flap of Amara's handbag, unzipped just slightly. Her fingers disappeared inside for 2 heartbeats. And then, the package was in. Small, vacuum-sealed, nearly weightless. It nestled perfectly into the side pouch, tucked between a charger cable and a folded boarding pass. Kendra zipped the bag, patted the seat, smoothed the blanket Amara hadn't asked for, then walked away like nothing had happened. No one said a word. No one stopped her. And no one, not even Amara, knew yet what had just taken place. 15 minutes passed. Amara returned, refreshed, calm. Margaret glanced up as she sat down. "That flight attendant was fussing with your seat just now," she murmured. Amara offered a polite smile. But inside, something prickled. She opened her tablet again, but didn't touch it. Instead, she scanned the area around her. Something felt different, shifted, disturbed. But her bag looked untouched, everything in its place. Nothing obviously missing or added. Still, her gut tightened, that silent warning that had saved her more than once. At the front of the plane, Kendra picked up the cabin phone. Her voice was calm, flat, professional. "Captain, I have a security concern in first class. A passenger is behaving suspiciously. I believe she may be carrying illegal substances." There was a pause on the other end, then quiet agreement. Kendra hung up, took a breath. She smoothed her uniform, adjusted her collar, and signaled to the air marshal, a plainclothes officer seated just outside of first class. He nodded and stood, walking toward the front. The intercom chimed. Passengers looked up. The air marshal, accompanied by Kendra and another attendant, approached seat 2A. "Ma'am," he said with practiced firmness, "we've received a report of suspicious behavior. I'm going to need to check your bag." The cabin fell into a hush. All heads turned. Phones appeared in hands. Cameras began rolling. Amara looked up slowly, her expression unreadable. "On what grounds?" she asked calmly. "Air safety regulations permit searches in flight if a credible concern is raised," he replied. "And who raised the concern?" "That information is confidential at this time." Amara gave a small nod. Her fingers never trembled. "Then proceed. I have nothing to hide." Kendra leaned forward with just the right amount of theatrical hesitation. She unzipped the bag. Her hand moved with deliberate slowness. And then she paused. Gasps rippled as she lifted the small sealed packet into view. "Here it is," she said, loudly enough for the entire cabin to hear. "Prescription-grade narcotics. Not labeled, not declared." The phone zoomed in. Someone whispered, "Unbelievable." Another murmured, "I knew it." Margaret stared wide-eyed, her hand trembling slightly on the armrest. The marshal turned serious. "Ma'am, you'll need to come with me. We'll handle this on the ground." Amara stood, slow and graceful, her face a mask of control. The stares around her were sharp, cutting, some curious, some satisfied, and every second was being captured, documented, uploaded, broadcast. As she walked the aisle, flanked by silence and cell phones, Amara didn't lower her head. She looked straight ahead, unflinching, unapologetic. But inside, she knew what had happened. She just didn't yet have the proof. Not yet. The world saw a black woman being caught red-handed, but the camera lied. Amara didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't flinch when the air marshal gripped her elbow, firm but professional. "That is not mine," she said, clearly and evenly. "I've never seen that package before in my life." No one responded. Not the marshal, not the other passengers, not even Kendra, who now stood a few feet back, arms crossed, her face a careful mix of concern and smug satisfaction. Silence. The kind that presses against your chest, not because of the altitude, but because of what it says without words. Amara picked up her carry-on. She walked down the aisle surrounded by stares that had already decided her story. Some eyes were wide with scandal, others narrow with judgment. A few turned away, those were the worst. The people who didn't even want to look at her, as if looking might somehow infect them. One voice, low and sharp, cut through the hush. Figures. First class ain't for them anyway. Another murmured, good thing they caught her before she landed. Who knows what she was planning to do? A chuckle followed that one. Soft, cruel, confident. Margaret turned sharply in her seat, glaring at the man who'd spoken. But she said nothing. Her lips pressed tightly together, hands gripping her shawl like a prayer. Amara didn't look back until she reached the cabin door. Then she paused. She turned her head slowly. Her eyes swept the first-class cabin. Each passenger caught in mid-thought. A sea of faces watching her like she was no longer one of them, if she ever had been. Her gaze landed on Kendra, for just a second. Kendra looked away. Amara didn't speak, didn't shake her head, didn't smile. She didn't need to. The look she gave, calm, cold, piercing, was louder than anything she could have said. As she stepped off the plane, the corridor felt longer than usual. 2 airport officers were waiting at the jet bridge. They took her calmly. No cuffs, no shoving. But the implication was clear. You are not trusted. They led her through side hallways, not through the public terminal, not through the luxury lounges or business traveler corridors. No. They brought her through back doors and low ceilings, concrete floors and flickering lights, the place where the accused go. Each footstep echoed a little louder. Each silence dragged a little longer. In the holding room, they asked for her ID. She gave them her real name. No aliases, no games. Amara Davis, she said, handing over her passport. Born in Baltimore, U.S. citizen. They searched her bag again. The package was placed into a clear evidence pouch. Photos were taken. Forms filled out. She sat in a metal chair, nothing else in the room but a table bolted to the floor. The younger officer leaned against the wall, arms crossed. The older one typed slowly into a government-issued laptop. Neither of them knew who she was. Not yet. Amara leaned back slightly, closed her eyes, took a breath. This wasn't fear. This wasn't panic. It was something else. It was fury held in stillness. Because she knew, if this had been another black woman, someone without a badge, without clearance, without a camera pin and a direct line to Langley, she'd be headed to jail. Charged, booked, branded, her name plastered across the internet before anyone thought to ask, what if she's innocent? No news station would wait for the truth. No airline would issue an apology. No one would care enough to rewind the footage and look harder. Amara had seen it before. Files, reports, headlines, lives destroyed before they even had a chance to defend themselves. And this time, it could have been her. She opened her eyes, looked at the 2 officers still treating her like a suspect, like a problem. She would wait. And when the moment came, she would turn this entire situation inside out. Not just for herself, but for every person who ever sat in a seat they were told they didn't belong in. She'd trained for danger. She'd walked into terrorist cells and foreign war zones. She'd faced men with guns and rooms wired to explode. But nothing had prepared her for this kind of humiliation. The officers left the room. They said they needed to verify her identity, that someone from upstairs was reviewing her file, that they'd be back shortly. Amara simply nodded, then sat in silence, hands folded neatly, spine straight. She didn't tap her foot. She didn't pace. She waited with the kind of stillness that made others uncomfortable. Because the truth didn't panic, it prepared. 5 minutes later, the door opened. The older officer returned, his tone slightly more hesitant than before. Ma'am, before we continue, you mentioned you needed to make a call. Amara stood slowly. She reached into her wallet and pulled out a card. Black, matte, with no name, just a government seal and a 10-digit number. She placed it gently on the table. Call that, she said. Tell them you have Amara Davis in custody. The officer blinked, then picked up the card like it might burn his fingers. He stepped outside. The door closed. 30 seconds passed, then a minute, then voices, urgent, muffled, footsteps, and then silence again. When the door reopened, both officers returned. This time, they looked very different, tension in their shoulders, color drained from their faces. The older one spoke first. Agent Davis, we're so sorry. We didn't realize. Amara didn't move. I'd like my belongings back, she said evenly, and I need a secure line to Langley, now. They moved quickly. Within minutes, she was transferred to another room. This one quieter, more private, equipped with a secure phone and a monitor. As she connected her tie pin to the encrypted port, the screen flickered. Authorization code, Delta Zulu 419. The feed opened, and the footage began to play. From the perspective of her seat, the hidden camera captured it all. Kendra approaching, looking around, leaning forward, seemingly adjusting a blanket, then unzipping the bag, reaching in, sliding something inside, clear, unmistakable, cold, deliberate framing. Amara watched without flinching. She'd already lived it. Now the world would see it too. She clipped the footage, labeled it, encrypted it, then forwarded it to Langley's Central Operations Unit. Begin internal case file, she said aloud. Subject Kendra Miles, Flight 237, suspected narcotic smuggling, false accusation, racial profiling, use of commercial aircraft for illicit trafficking. She paused, then added one more line. Primary mistake. She picked the wrong passenger. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the terminal, Margaret Whitmore was doing something she never thought she'd do. She was speaking to a security supervisor. Her voice was trembling, but clear. In her hand, she held her phone, and on that phone was her video. She had recorded the moment Kendra leaned over Amara's seat. She hadn't meant to at first. It was just instinct. But something had felt off. Too performative, too rehearsed. And now she was grateful she hadn't deleted it. I saw her plant something, Margaret said quietly. She was pretending to fix the seat, but her hand went into the bag. The officer reviewed the clip, then called for backup. 2 pieces of evidence, 2 women, one story finally cracking open. Back in the secure room, Amara received confirmation. The footage had been verified, her identity reinstated. The agency would now move swiftly, coordinating with the airline, federal transportation officials, and airport security. But that wasn't enough. Amara wasn't done. She leaned forward, her voice calm but iron hard. I want a full crew manifest, employment records, security logs. I want to know who else on that plane has been compromised. Because this wasn't just about her anymore. This was a system, a network, and someone had just triggered its collapse. Somewhere in the same terminal, unaware of what was unfolding, Kendra was still smiling, still thinking she'd won, still thinking the video of her heroic discovery would make her famous. But fame was a funny thing. So was surveillance, especially when you picked the wrong person to frame. Everything was recorded. Kendra didn't just frame the wrong woman, she framed the worst possible one. The ballroom was bathed in warm light. Soft classical music floated through the air as flight crews from across the region found their seats, chatting quietly over complimentary lattes and name-tagged welcome folders. At the front of the room, a stage stood adorned with the airline's signature blue and gold backdrop. A banner stretched across it, honoring excellence in passenger safety, Flight 237. And at the center of it all, Kendra Miles. She sat in the front row, uniform crisp, hair perfect, smile composed. But beneath that calm exterior, her heart was pounding with pride. She'd done it. The video of her discovery had gone viral. Social media was flooded with praise. Colleagues were calling her brave, observant, sharp under pressure. Today, she'd be recognized. And maybe, just maybe, this would finally be her step up. The promotion she'd deserved, the spotlight she'd been denied. She glanced at the seat next to her. Empty. Her fellow attendant Tyler was running late, probably stuck in traffic. Kendra smoothed her skirt and crossed her legs elegantly. This was her moment. The room quieted as the airline's CEO, Richard Hamilton, took the stage. Distinguished, silver-haired, every inch the corporate commander. He smiled at the crowd. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today as we honor the outstanding actions of our crew aboard Flight 237. Polite applause followed. That flight reminded us of something critical, that vigilance matters. That heroes don't always wear capes, they wear uniforms just like the ones in this room. Kendra's smile deepened. This was it. He was building to her. But then, before we move to recognitions, Hamilton continued, his tone shifting slightly, I want to introduce someone who will be playing a key role in the future of our airline's security operations. Whispers rippled through the audience. Kendra tilted her head. She comes to us with extensive experience in counterintelligence and transportation security, Hamilton said. And after a thorough federal review, she'll be leading our new partnership initiative with national law enforcement. There was a pause. Then he said it. Please welcome Director of Airborne Investigations, Special Agent Amara Davis, CIA. The side doors opened. Gasps filled the room. Amara walked in. Gone was the quiet first-class passenger. Gone was the accused. She wore a tailored black suit. Her CIA credentials hung visible on a lanyard. Her steps were firm, head high, eyes locked forward. The silence in the ballroom was absolute. Kendra froze. Her breath caught. Her mind scrambled for explanation, reason, denial. No, this isn't real. She was arrested. She was humiliated. This can't, but it was. And as Amara reached the podium, she paused just long enough to meet Kendra's eyes. Nothing in her face had changed. No smugness, no vengeance, just certainty. Amara took the microphone. Thank you, Mr. Hamilton. She turned to the audience, her voice clear and resonant. Yesterday, I boarded Flight 237 as part of a covert federal investigation. My mission was to assess potential breaches in crew integrity and identify internal smuggling activity. Murmurs began. Some gasps, some horrified glances toward Kendra. What I did not expect, Amara continued, was to become the target of a false accusation, driven not by protocol, but by prejudice. The screen behind her flickered on. This is what really happened. The video played. Kendra, leaning over Amara's seat, her hand slipping into the handbag, the package going in, the fake surprise, the call to the marshal, the show. Crystal clear, unforgiving. Phones fell silent, laughter died in throats, heads turned slowly toward Kendra. She looked down. Then up, then away. Her hands were shaking. Amara turned back to the crowd. I've served my country for 15 years. I've operated in war zones and enemy territory. But I've never felt more violated than I did on that flight. Not because I was framed, but because the person who did it thought no one would believe me. She assumed that the world would see a black woman in first class, and doubt she belonged. Her voice never rose. It didn't need to. Every word landed like a weight. Then she turned, just slightly, toward Kendra. You didn't just break the law, Amara said. You used racism as your weapon. And that ends today. The silence in the ballroom shattered as two plainclothes federal agents stepped forward and approached Kendra's seat. She stood, reflexively. Wait, this is a misunderstanding, she stammered. This isn't what it looks like. The agents didn't respond. They simply read her rights, out loud, in front of everyone. Click. The sound of handcuffs echoed through the room louder than the applause ever had. Gasps turned into stunned silence. Phones trembled in hands, now recording something far different from what people expected. Kendra's perfect hair didn't matter anymore, nor her smile, nor her poise, nor her fabricated moment of heroism. It was over. And across the room, a few people began to understand what they just witnessed. Wasn't a fall from grace. It was justice coming in full view. Tyler, her silent co-conspirator, tried to slip away unnoticed, but his phone was already being tracked. His conversations flagged. He didn't get far. In less than 24 hours, the entire smuggling network began to unravel. Flight logs, messaging apps, crew assignments, names began to surface. People who had quietly used their uniforms, their access, their privilege to traffic drugs across borders, hidden under the illusion of professionalism. And it had worked. Until now. Back on the stage, CEO Richard Hamilton stepped up beside Amara. He looked pale, but determined. We have failed, he said into the microphone. Not only in protocol, but in culture, in silence, in not listening when it mattered. He turned to the crowd. Effective immediately, Atlantic Airways will partner with the CIA and Department of Transportation in a joint task force to investigate internal corruption, root out racial bias in service, and reform our training from the ground up. This wasn't just PR, it was the beginning of a reckoning. Toward the back of the room, a quiet voice spoke. Excuse me. Amara looked up. It was Margaret, the elderly woman from seat 2B, scarf still perfectly folded, phone still in hand. One of the agents gently waved her forward. She walked to the stage, slow but steady, her steps unsure but her gaze unwavering. Amara met her halfway. They didn't speak, at least not with words. Margaret simply held out her phone, opened the video again, and handed it to the agent nearby. I thought someone should see the truth, she said softly. Then she turned to Amara, voice barely above a whisper. You weren't alone. The room grew still. Some people wiped their eyes, others bowed their heads, not out of shame but in respect. Because courage doesn't always shout. Sometimes it records quietly from across the aisle. Sometimes it speaks up after decades of watching the world stay silent. The video Margaret had captured, unedited, undeniable, became the companion piece to Amara's footage. It was played on every major news channel within 24 hours, and it changed the conversation. One woman had been framed, one woman had recorded it, one system had been exposed. But that wasn't the end, because from that day forward, policies changed, investigations launched, and a new kind of awareness took root among flight crews, passengers, and people who had always thought that would never happen here. And in that shift, something powerful emerged. A new truth. A reminder. One person stayed silent. One spoke up. One changed everything. The news cycle exploded. Headlines ran for days. CIA agent framed by flight attendant in viral video. Racial bias meets federal justice. Airline launches historic reform after undercover investigation. Amara Davis's name trended. Offers came from every major network, morning shows, talk shows, magazines. But she said no. She didn't need a camera. She didn't need applause. She didn't need to explain herself to a world that was already watching. She had done her job, and that was enough. 2 weeks later, in her quiet apartment outside D.C., she sat by the window, sunlight slanting across the floor in soft amber lines. She sipped her tea. No mission today, no surveillance, no hidden earpiece, just silence and peace. A small envelope rested on the table in front of her. The return address was handwritten. A school in Atlanta. Inside, folded carefully, was a letter. In purple ink. Carefully spaced letters. Tiny hearts over the eyes. Dear Miss Davis, my name is Chloe. I'm 11 years old. I saw the video where you got blamed but proved everyone wrong. You looked so strong and calm and smart. My mom says people like you change the world. I just wanted to say thank you for showing the world what strength looks like in someone who looks like me. Love, Chloe. Amara read it once, then again. And then, very gently, she placed it in a small wooden box lined with velvet. Inside were only two other things. Her first CIA badge, retired, worn at the edges, and a folded photograph of her mother, smiling beside a tiny Amara in a kindergarten graduation gown. She closed the lid, locked the box, and exhaled. Outside her window, a plane began taxiing down the runway. She watched it climb, slow and steady, into the sky. Thousands of feet in the air, strangers would sit side by side, some afraid, some excited, some just exhausted. Different colors, different names, different stories. And maybe, just maybe, the crew would treat them all the same. Not because they feared being caught, but because they finally understood. Amara smiled, soft and quiet. Not the smile of someone who had won, but of someone who had endured, who had stood firm in the face of injustice and made space for others to stand, too. Because justice isn't just about punishment. It's about reminders. Reminders that truth matters, that dignity survives, and that we belong. All of us. If this story moved you, please take a moment to like the video and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Your support means the world to us, and it gives our team the motivation to keep creating stories that matter. Don't forget to subscribe for more powerful, thought-provoking narratives. Together, we can make sure these voices are never silenced.